Wherever you're listening in the world, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this special IsraelCast episode coming to you from the sidelines of the Jewish National Fund USA 2024 conference in Dallas, Texas. I'm Steven Shalowitz, and before we begin the show and before we bring on our guest, I just want to thank so many of you who have thanked me and have come up to me and have shared how much you're enjoying the IsraelCast podcast, and for that, I am very grateful. All right, now on to the show. And for more than 120 years, Jewish National Fund USA has been the premier philanthropic movement for the land and people of Israel. While best known for planting trees in Israel, JNF USA contributes to Israeli life in so many ways, including community development in the Negev and the Galilee, preservation of heritage sites, supporting people with disabilities, connecting high school and college students to Israel, and helping our brothers and sisters in need following the heinous October 7th terrorist attack. To learn more and to see how you can contribute, do visit jnf.org. Once again, jnf.org. And we'd also love it if you subscribe, rated, and reviewed us, 5 stars, of course, wherever you get your podcasts, and please do share the show within your orbit. All right, as for our guest, it is an absolute honor to welcome Gadi Ezra to the program. Gadi is Israel's former National Public Diplomacy Unit Director, where he was responsible for coordinating and integrating public diplomacy issues of national importance. He coordinated many high-level diplomatic events, including U.S. President Joe Biden's visit to Israel, and orchestrated national forest-building projects. A human rights attorney, and may we add, a grad of Tel Aviv University and New York University, and Israel's Special Forces veteran. Gadi has shared his unique perspective on war with thousands and thousands of audiences worldwide. He also provides strategic briefings regarding Israel's challenges in security, diplomatic, and legal matters. A frequent commentator and contributor for Israeli and foreign media on national security and diplomacy issues, Gadi is also the author of 11 Days in Gaza. You can pick up a copy wherever you like to buy your books. Gadi, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to IsraelCast.
Thanks for having me. What an intro. It's a downhill from here.
I don't think so. Listen, we had such a great conversation both last night and this morning before we started rolling that I can tell you're one of those guests that we want to have on more than once here on IsraelCast. So consider this an open invitation. You're a Ben Bite right here on IsraelCast. So absolutely. Well, listen, let's get started right now. And as I just mentioned, you wrote the book 11 Days in Gaza. What would surprise us most about Gaza, about the territory? And you can really answer that question any way you like.
Yeah. Well, 11 Days in Gaza discusses my team's true story from the first meaningful operation in Gaza following the disengagement plan, which took place at the end of 2008. I'm talking about Operation Cast-led. But I've also been to Gaza during this war as we speak.
As a reservist?
As a reservist, of course. I've done over 260 days of reserve duty, which is a true privilege. I'm actually returning to my team in just a couple of days to continue this privilege and honor of doing reserve duty. And what's interesting, both in retrospective regarding the end of 2008 and also now, is the following. First of all, especially during Swords of Iron, the October 7th war, is how Hamas is embedded within the civilian population. And when I'm saying embedded, I mean in two different ways. First, physical. You know, you're going to houses in Khan Yunis. I've been to Khan Yunis on January. You're seeing civilian compounds in Jabalia. And it looks ordinary. It looks like, a normal neighborhood. But then you quickly realize that underneath you, there is an entire infrastructure of tunnels that was discovered that contained cages in which hostages were held. And you're thinking to yourself, there's no possible way that the civilian population was not aware of that. You cannot do something like that without the people living in the building don't know about. And the second aspect of this embedment regards to the ideological aspect. When you walk into a home, even in America, it's pretty easy to see what the temper of this house is. We have pictures of our kids, the people that we admire, works of art from various places in the world. And the same goes with the Gazans. But in every single house, you see a complete denial regarding the existence of the State of Israel, meaning you would see maps of the country that both you and I are familiar with. We both call it Israel, but on their maps, it doesn't exist. And I'm not just talking about the 67 lines, right? I'm talking about everything. Tel Aviv, Yafo, Ra'anana, all those places are named with Arabic names, and this is, probably one of the materialization for them are from the river to the sea, right? The second thing I want to tell you about Gaza that struck me the most when I've been there in the past few months is actually the amount of wealth that I've seen. There is a myth about Gaza being the biggest open-air prison on the planet. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of poverty in Gaza as well. I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything. Gaza is not the first place in which I'll invest my first shekel when I'm investing in real estate, right?
Not yet.
Not yet. Well, not that I have money to invest in real estate, right?
Well, but what I'm saying is one day,
of
hopefully,
course.
It will be rebuilt, yeah.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is you see a lot of wealth as well. And I've written about this in 11 Days in Gaza as well. You see like beautiful villas with swimming pools and beautiful lawns. So yes, there is poverty, but there is another side to Gaza, and it's a substantial part. It's a substantial part, and it exists, and it also shows you what Hamas was willing to give up when they launched the October 7th attack. It wasn't just to release the poor Gazans, it's also to sacrifice the good lives that some of them had.
And who's behind that wealth?
Well, obviously Hamas. Hamas is, and there were many articles about this. Hamas is controlling the supply and demand in the Gaza Strip. Everything that entered Gaza in the past 10, 15 years was controlled by Hamas. They created an enormous inflation in the Gazan markets. By the way, also today, the humanitarian aid that Israel is enabling to enter to Gaza is stolen in substantial amounts by Hamas, creating a true sense of urgency in the Gazan markets. There is a lot of protest against Gazan vendors among Gazans because they have to raise up the prices. So just to get you into numbers, if you'd like to buy a cigarette in the Gaza Strip, one cigarette, you'll have to say goodbye to $30. And we're talking about a territory in which before October 7th, the average salary was 1,200 shekels. All right, so now you'll have to say goodbye to something like, I don't know, more than 100 shekels for just one cigarette, not a pack.
And for our listeners that don't use shekels but use U.S. dollars?
So $30, it's a lot of money for one cigarette. And the third thing which was very, interesting to me, is that the experiences as a combat soldier don't really change. Because war is war is war. So yes, the circumstances are different. Nothing is like the horrendous October 7th attack. We have hostages. We've experienced an enormous devastation, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. Mm-hmm. But once you're there, as a combat soldier, the small moments in between are kind of identical. In almost every book that's written about war is conveyed through either heroism or tragedy. But whoever went to war really knows that war is not just about that. It's about a lot of small moments in between. It's about joy and laughter. There's a lot of joy and laughter in war as well because you're with your best friends together. You have to laugh sometimes to keep your sanity. You're not laughing, of course, about the devastating situation in which civilians are at, but you're laughing with your friends because you are together. And this is something, by the way, similar to every military in the world. There's a lot of boredom. There is a lot of fear and anxiety. So this entire spectrum of feelings and emotion comprises this very humane experience called war.
I want to go back to something that you said a moment ago about the tunnels below houses and other institutions. Can you give us a sense of the proximity of the civilian population really to those tunnels, to those cages? I mean, really, how close were they?
Steven, to say proximity implies that they were in two different locations, but they were very close. that would be a misrepresentation of reality. They were in the exact same location. Because
Right, but what I'm saying is that if you have the house and then you have the tunnel right below it,
the entrance to
it's
the
right
tunnel
there.
is from the kid's bedroom.
Yeah.
Underneath the kid's bedroom, right next to a painting of Mickey Mouse. It's right next to the parking lot. It's all over. You need to understand, there is an entire Gaza underground. There are two Gazas. There's the Gaza that you can see visually when you're there, and there's the Gaza of underground with an astonishing infrastructure of tunnels that were prepared for this day to enable Hamas to maintain war against the most powerful military in the Middle East, but also to keep hostages away from the IDF.
And let's not forget UNRWA's involvement with that, in that Hamas was using the UNRWA electricity, weren't they?
Well, Hamas was using UNRWA in many aspects. Look, if you
I was just talking in terms of I'm using the term proximity, but you know what I mean, the closeness of everything.
Yeah, well, but it's even more than that,
Yeah.
Stephen, because, look, the vast majority of employees in the Gaza Strip of UNRWA are locals.
Yeah.
So you can't really distinguish between the both. It's not like there was a delegation of 100, 200 people from the West coming to help the Gaza. It's the Gazans themselves. So one should not be surprised when he or she are obviously suddenly are exposed to cases in which UNRWA employees were actively participating in the October 7th attack on Israel and inciting the younger generation in Gaza and inflaming anti-Semitism in the textbooks of kids in the Gaza Strip.
Yeah. I mean, it's just absolutely astonishing. I mean, when you think about it, what UNRWA has been doing there, and nobody has stopped them. Of course, there have been calls for UNRWA to reform or to be totally disbanded, but of course that is not likely to happen, is it?
Look, first of all, it's also a tragedy because an entire generation of kids in Gaza is lost because of the education to anti-Semitism and hatred that they've received from UNRWA. There are legal means to handle with UNRWA. There are other aid agencies that the United Nations maintain. And hopefully, when the day after plans are going to be crafted and agreed upon with international allies, UNRWA cannot be part of that simply because they have it's not only that they failed, they were an active contributor to the tragedy.
To the incitement.
To the incitement, to the hatred, to the horrendous result that we see on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, because when you think about it, Israel disengaged in 2005.
Right.
And so if you were born in 2005 and you're a teenager now, you grew up on UNRWA textbooks, didn't you?
You know, even more so if you think about it. When I was a combat soldier in 2008, and these are the scenes that I'm describing in 11 Days in Gaza. The kids that we saw there are the Nukba terrorists of October 7th.
Yeah.
So what happened during this time? What kind of education did they got? I know that during this time, during those years, I was trying to educate myself for creating a better environment for my people, for our region, to make it a prosperous area. It's a different ballgame when you're talking about Gaza.
Indeed. Well, in general, what don't we know that we should know about how the war then, the execution of the war against Hamas is being waged?
It's a good, when I went to NYU, I was also always taught to say it's a good question for everything, but that's a really good question.
We try here on IsraelCast.
Yeah. Yes, it's politeness.
Thank you.
Look, I can tell you, I'm not the best lawyer in the world. And I'm not the best combat soldier in the world. Far from that. My teammates are war heroes.
And by the way, we should share with our listeners, we are on the sidelines of a conference and someone's trying to get into this room right now. So if we hear some noise in the background, that's what that's all about. But carry on.
It's a test for our ability to maintain, focus.
Right.
So as I was saying, I'm not the best lawyer in the world, and I'm far from being the best combat soldier. God knows my teammates are heroes, and it's an honor just to fight alongside them. But I'm one of those rare people who hold this dual perspective on war, as both a human rights attorney and as a special forces reservist, meaning I know how the translation of these laws, of the Geneva Conventions and the Hague regulations, looks like in real life, in real combat. And what I can tell you is that there is no other military in the world that applies higher standards than the IDF. Yes, mistakes do happen sometimes, right? I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything, but when mistakes happen, we investigate, we indict. We're making sure and to do anything in our power to ensure that these wrongdoings are remained as the exception rather than the custom. And I'll tell you why we do that, Steven. It's not to go back to our civilian lives, wear a suit, and being interviewed in a podcast and say how great we are. It's because of a different reason. It's because there is a direct link between the way a nation conducts its warfare and the way it conducts its society. If we were to be barbarians on the battlefield just because we can, and thank God we can, the IDF is a very powerful military, these norms will be integrated into our civilian lives and harms every checks and balances in our fragile society. And that is especially relevant to a country with a military of its own people. We don't have a professional military. Our soldiers, our reservists are us. It's the accountant, it's the lawyer, it's the teacher. So there is an immense importance to maintain these high standards when it's possible. When it's more challenging, it's just the adherence to the laws of armed conflict, to their standards. But if you think me, losing this compass, not Iran, not Hezbollah, that is the true danger to the Zionist project we're all part of. And I'm very proud to say, based on my operational experience, not just academic or professional experience, we're doing a good job in this sense. And may we keep applying these high standards, not just for the operational reasons, but for the sake of our society.
We have a very global audience, as I like to say here on the program. And for those that might not be familiar with just how meticulous the IDF is in terms of protecting civilian life, I'm wondering if you can shed some light on that.
Right. So it's interesting. Look, when you're talking about so let me just wear my regalia as a lawyer for a second, and let me take my helmet down as a reservist. When you're talking about the laws of war, there are different sets of norms and principles that a Western military must adhere to. The principle of necessity, meaning that you are targeting targets that are going to weaken the other side, nothing else. A principle of distinction, meaning that you distinguish between military objective and civilian objectives. The principle of proportionality, meaning that you are not causing more harm than you need to. But if you'll go to an IDF soldier during boot camp and you'll ask him or her, what do you think about the principle of distinction? They would tell you, what do you want from my life? Because they're not familiar with these distinctions from an academic perspective. But these principles are embedded in our trainings from day one.
And elaborate a little bit more on this notion of distinction.
So, two examples. The first thing that an IDF soldier in boot camp hears when he or she are going to the shooting range, do you know what that is? It's not make sure that you're hitting right to the head of the target. It's hold your weapon in 60 degrees. And you know why? Because if you're going to fire a bullet by mistake, the angle of the rifle will make sure that it's less likely that you'll hit someone else. That's just to prove and to show to you that our goal is not just to eliminate, but also spare lives that should be spared. And the second example that I want to give you is much more operational and practical. When you are there on the ground, you are paying attention constantly to the proximity between the civilian population and the terrorists. The terrorists are using the civilian population as human shields, as a war method. Now, I know all of our audiences here heard that gazillion times, but just to give you a true example that I have experienced, right? So in Khan Yunis in January, just a few months ago, when we were watching a compound of Hamas, we saw kids playing soccer right at the entrance to that military compound, and let me assure you, they weren't playing soccer there because it was a great field. They were forced to do so. In Jabalia in May, we saw terrorists using an UNRWA facility as a military cache. While kids are playing in the background, in the backyard, I'm sorry. Kids were, so you are constantly trying to distinguish between the both and engage only in the right moments in which you would avoid harming civilians, and I'm proud to say that we've done so, to harm the civilians and target the terrorists. Now, what's being echoed in the media are usually the places in which there is high collateral damage, meaning civilians are being hurt, which is, by the way, from a legal point of view, not illegal, but it happens. It's part of this awful phenomena called war. Or when sensitive facilities are being hurt, like mosques or churches. These are facilities that are cynically used by the terrorist organizations under the knowledge that even if the IDF will target them, then at least if they lost from a kinetic point of view, they would win the PR war or the information war because, hey, it never looks good when you're bombing a mosque or a church. Although, from a legal point of view, once a civilian or religious compound is used for military purposes, this facility loses its legal immunity, right? But explaining that in the media, it's a difficult task. And that's a different front that we're facing in the information domain.
So assuming that, and if you can kind of walk us through this, so assuming there's a church in Gaza, because Gaza has Christians,
yes.
assuming that there's a
they're
church.
They're a minority.
And they're a minority, but
yeah.
they're there. And Hamas is using the church to store weaponry.
Right.
And there may be some very high-profile Hamas terrorists. They're hiding in the church.
Right.
Yet there are also nuns and priests and parishioners in the church as well. So the IDF then will make that calculus whether or not to take out that church because getting that high-profile Hamas terrorist out is of import to Israel. Can you walk us through that?
So from a legal point of view, once you see that church is being used for military purposes, that church loses its legal immunity, right? And then you have to evaluate the legality of the target according to the principle of proportionality. What the principle of proportionality basically says from a legal point of view is that a military action is forbidden if the collateral damage it causes is excessive to the military advantage. If the collateral damage it causes is excessive to the military advantage.
And who determines that?
All right, so you have specific orders when you go to the battlefield. Sometimes they would go down to numbers. It's also, there are different mechanisms, such as you're not going to be the only one making the call. You're going to be, so for example, if you are on the ground and you're seeing the church being used for military purposes, and you cannot attack the church or the terrorists in the church, to be more precise, yourself, because you're from the distance. You're using a drone or you're using a binocular to see them, right? You would ask for a chopper or an F-16 or a UAV, to attack those terrorists. And once you're going to do that, you're going to go on the radio with high-rank commanders asking for this fire. They will have to evaluate the proportionality of the attack as well. So we apply different layers of mechanisms to ensure that any attack is precise, not causing excessive collateral damage, and sometimes when we can and when reality allows that, we would forfeit our advantage and we would wait for a better time window, despite the fact that legally you can target, but we would wait for a better time window. Why? Because of what I've said previously, because if you're applying these high standards, you are making your lives more complicated, but you can look at yourself in the mirror also. Because you want to maintain the morals during wartime as well, because you have to go back to your civilian lives at some point. So it would be a process. It's not going to be an instant thing.
In war happens so quickly, and I think that's really
quickly.
The point. We had, whom you know, Ron Bar Yoshafat here on the program, and we wish him very well because he's actually, as we record this now, he's back in Gaza. And what he told me was, he said, he was in a house with his soldiers, and there was oil and flour in the house, and there was gunfire all around the house. He said, and they were having a debate whether or not they should take the oil and flour out, should they destroy the house with the oil and flour in it, and what should they do? Oil and flour while there's gunfire around the house. And so, war is happening instantaneously, yet what you're talking about is that the IDF is making decisions, really important decisions about what to do, and when especially civilians are involved. And because if they just wanted to carpet bomb a whole area with churches and high-profile terrorists there, as well as civilians, certainly they could just do that.
Right.
But they're not.
And it's constant, decision making.
Yes.
You're always.
Have you been in a situation like that you could share? I want to be respectful of you.
No, it's
and,
fine.
and I
You're
see,
very thoughtful.
And I see you smiling right now. So if you can't say, I totally respect that.
I'm not smiling of joy, obviously. Yes, we have been to situations of intense decision making. So, for example, I can share with you a scenario that I've written about in 11 Days in Gaza. In one of the northern neighborhoods.
And we're talking about 2008.
2008, but I can
Yeah.
assure you we've experienced the same things also now during Soldiers of Iron. But since I've written about this, it's easier for me to talk about this. So at some point, we're seeing a terrorist holding an AK-47. He's standing on the third floor of a building. He's holding a binocular looking for IDF soldiers. We see him, but he cannot see us because we're camouflaged. We look like the sand dune right in front of him. He has no idea we're seeing him. Now, if I had the Geneva Conventions right there with me, they would have told me I'm doing the exact right thing by starting to engage with the helicopter above my head because of the principle of necessity, right? The principle of necessity basically says that weakening the other party to an armed conflict is the only legitimate cause in war. Now, you will agree with me that targeting a Hamas terrorist during war is weakening the other party, therefore it amounts to a legitimate cause. But life, as they tend to be, we're a bit more complicated than that because right next to that terrorist, we spotted a woman. That woman, we couldn't prove that she's a terrorist. And we couldn't prove that she's voluntarily serving as a human shield. Now, the principle of distinction does acknowledge the fact that civilians can find themselves at the midst of the war zone as well. And it says that civilians are immune from any attack unless they are directly participating in the hostilities themselves. DPH, that's how we lawyers like to call it. But as said, we couldn't prove it. We didn't have a sniper in our team. We didn't had an Apache above our head, which means that you can target the terrorists, but it's very likely that the woman would be hurt as well. Now, according to the laws of war, that doesn't mean that the terrorist shall enjoy the legal immunity granted to the woman because of the principle of proportionality. Now, any lawyer that listens to us right now knows that proportionality is a word that we lawyers love to use. In any context, in any field of the law. But as said, in the context of the laws of war, it basically says that a military action is forbidden if the collateral damage it causes is excessive to the military advantage. Now, what was even more challenging for us is that after 1 hour of looking at them, trying to spot the right time window, we realized she's holding a baby. That's how cynical those terrorists were. Now, we know for a fact that Hamas is forcing Gazans to stay with their kids and serve as human shields during wartime. And they also forces them to make terrible decisions, like, Sophie's choice. If you're not going to stay with one kid, we're going to kill the other 4, right? So we waited for a time window. We've waited for a time window in which we could operate, and she gladly went to the restrooms or whatever she was allowed to do. And some of us still do remember the missile go right through the window. The terrorist is no longer with us if you're concerned. But did we apply higher standards than the legal ones? Yes. Did we make our lives more complicated? Yes. But can we sleep better at night? Yes, we can.
Well, thanks for sharing that. Did you hear Colonel Kemp yesterday?
I didn't, but Colonel Kemp is phenomenal, so I know it's my loss.
Yes, well, we had him here on IsraelCast. He talks about the numbers when the Hamas health ministry or the Gaza health ministry issues that they issue out, which of course is run by Hamas, and he talks about how they give the number of 40,000, but yet something. I'm just wondering if you know those numbers, if you can take us through those numbers at all.
I don't remember all the numbers by heart, but I can tell you that one should be very suspicious regarding the numbers.
Yeah.
Again, this is not to imply that civilians do not get hurt. That would be a disrespect to the people who are listening to us right now. Civilians get hurt during war. This is part of this awful scene. But I advise anyone to be very skeptical towards the number of a terrorist organization that also, by the way, does not distinguish between terrorists and civilians among those numbers.
Right, because what he talked about is there's approximately 25,000 terrorists that were killed out of the 40,000. And then you have those people in Gaza that were killed by Hamas, because Hamas kills people in Gaza.
True.
Then you have approximately 3,000 people that will die anyway within a year.
True.
Right, just out of illness and so on, accidents. And then you're left with the remaining. And also they don't differentiate, as you just said, between civilian and terrorists.
Right.
And also I believe they consider children, quote unquote, is anyone up to the age of 18 or so.
Right, so their definitions are very flexible.
Yeah.
Let's call it that way. They maneuver the numbers. What's interesting to know, though, and you've mentioned that some of the Gazans are being hurt by Hamas. Some of them are hurt or killed by Hamas, of course, intentionally, because they are suspected to be cooperative with the Zionist regime or whatever. But some, and that's interesting, are killed by misfire of Hamas. For example, during Operation Breaking Dawn, August 2022, I was serving as the director of Israel's National Public Diplomacy Unit back then. We knew that between 20 to 25% of the missiles shot by the Islamic Jihad were landing in Gaza and caused the death of Gazans.
And they were being shot from Gaza.
And one of the most known cases during Swords of Iron was the incident in El Ahli Hospital in Gaza, the famous hospital case in October that, Hamas were immediately, it's the IDF. Well, after a few hours, the IDF spokesperson unit were able to prove that that was a misfire of Hamas and the Islamic Jihad that landed in the hospital and caused the death of many Gazans. Again, that was in a different level that caused an entire media fiasco against Israel. But talking from a kinetic and legal point of view, yes, they do misfire a lot at their civilians as well, because they fire indiscriminately. They don't really care if they fire at IDF soldiers or Israeli civilians, but also if they hit Gazans. Everything serves their purposes, because if they hit Gazans, well, it's a media gain.
Indeed. And when we talk about the math, then it's been estimated, and Colonel Kemp has been very outspoken in sharing that this is about a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of civilian deaths to terrorist deaths. And this is very, very low, probably the lowest in any kind of similar combat situation. And so it's lower than the United States and Britain and Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. And so that needs to be said as well. And it points to the notion of, again, the numbers being cooked by Hamas, and what's really behind the numbers, and the care that the IDF takes in going against really just combatants, against Hamas terrorists. So much more to talk about. I want to move up to the north. And I don't know if I have a question in particular, but it absolutely, I don't know if it shocks me. It does and it doesn't shock me. The fact that UNIFIL was there and that Hezbollah right under their noses. I mean, we were talking about Hamas under the noses of the people in Gaza, but again, under the noses of UNIFIL, a UN organization.
Yeah.
And what saith Gadi?
Well, those who listened to us, again, didn't see that I was smiling. Again, two things regarding the situation in the north. The first is that you're absolutely right. The proximity between Hezbollah and Radwan forces, Radwan is the elite unit of Hezbollah, compounds and UNIFIL bases is astonishing. I'm talking about, sometimes 50 meters Not even more than that. In matrix translation, but it would be like a few yards, right?
And by the way, I just realized, for any listener that doesn't know what UNIFIL is.
UNIFIL is a peacekeeping force that was placed in Lebanon many years ago in order to maintain the peace and tranquility in this very fragile area.
From the United Nations.
From the United Nations, right. UNIFIL...
United Nations International Forces in Lebanon.
Exactly. Now, UNIFIL, of course, failed because what people need to understand about southern Lebanon is that it looks like a legitimate, regular civilian territory, but it was actually used by Hezbollah as an entire military compound. What we saw there, and I was fortunate to contribute to defending our joint homeland, also in the northern arena, was absolutely breathtaking in the sense that what they have prepared there for an October 7th style attack on Israeli northern villages is extremely worrying. I don't know why they have decided not to join Hamas and execute their Galilee plan, right? That they were planning for many years, but they were just firing thousands of rockets since then. And just to get you into numbers, as of last month, the first anniversary of October 7th, we have experienced more than 12,000 rockets being shot from Lebanon. That's in addition to more than 13,000 rockets being shot from the Gaza Strip, 400 rockets from Iran, 180 from Yemen, and 60 from Syria, right? And I'm not even talking about Judea and Samaria and other arenas as well. But going back to the northern arena, what we found there is astonishing. Now, the first thing I wanted to say about UNIFIL in this regard, and that is just to give you the context, is that UNIFIL failed not just because their soldiers are not brave, right? It failed because it was tasked with an impossible mission in the first place. UNIFIL is a peacekeeping force with no peace to keep, right? And keeping peace and creating peace are whole different tasks. Creating peace is not a mission for an operative UN organ to lead. This is something that should be led in the UN headquarters. Now, the problem is, if you look at the UN Security Council, for example, there's a constant deadlock because of the global, larger war we're in between the West and the East, Russia, China, the United States of America. The UN Secretary General Office didn't really pay attention to many complaints. Some, not all of them were filed by the IDF in Israel against Hezbollah, some by UNIFIL. So UNIFIL was tasked with an impossible mission in the first place. That's the first point I want to echo. And the second regards to the emerging ceasefire agreement we're currently seeing, led by the current U.S. administration.
Mm-hmm. By the way, we're talking about the Biden administration.
The Biden administration.
Right, because we're going to be uploading this.
Right.
Well, we'll upload this before January 20th.
Hopefully.
Yes. Inshallah.
Inshallah. But Bezrat Hashem.
Bezrat Hashem, yes.
But what's interesting to learn is that according to the leaked, again, I'm relying on the media here, according to the leaked draft, there is a certain expectation that the state of Lebanon would be able to apply sovereignty south of the Litani River after 6 months. Steven, with all due respect, I think this is an unrealistic expectation because Lebanon of recent years is not just a country in a crisis. What used to be the pearl of the Middle East is now a shell of a country. There is 44% of poverty in the state of Lebanon. And years of corruption, of mismanagement, of social cohesion were a fertile ground for Iranian takeover, territory, and political institution in this country. Therefore, the ceasefire agreement we're currently seeing should be an annex to a broader agreement of rehabilitating the state of Lebanon to make sure that this is a country that would be able to apply, not in 6 months, in 3, 4, 5 years from now, actual sovereignty in southern Lebanon and make sure Israel does not find Lebanon in clash with Lebanon again. That would not just prevent the next war with Israel, it would set the Lebanese people free.
It's a fascinating country. I know it well. I've been there. And, one can only wish the Lebanese people well because they just want to live in peace.
Exactly.
I mean, that's really
Couldn't
it.
agree more.
That's really it at the end of the day. I want to turn our focus to the hostages.
Right.
And with calls for bring them home.
Right.
I sometimes think to myself, there have to be negotiations going on in the background and things that we just don't know because the Israeli government, for security reasons, don't want to share it. And I can understand that. And, wearing your public diplomacy hat, I'm wondering if you can shed any light on that.
Right.
For the security of the hostages, right? I mean, if they know where the hostages are and they say, yes, we know where, these 10 hostages are, and Hamas gets wind of that, they might move the hostages or they might, bring even further trauma to them.
Right. So from an operational point of view or an intelligence point of view,
Or
there's
both.
Or both. There's a lot of work being done in this regard. The vast majority of it is confidential. And I think it's better not to talk about it publicly. But what's important for me to convey regarding the hostages is the following. Look, first of all, to put people in context, for those of us who are not familiar with the numbers, Hamas kidnapped on October 7th 251 Israelis and non-Israelis, by the way, civilians and soldiers alike. By that time, we already had 4 Israelis held hostage in the Gaza Strip, 2 civilians and 2 soldiers.
Pre-October 7th.
Pre-October 7th. Throughout the different weeks and months following October 7th, Israel was managed to release or rescue 154 of them, either in hostage deals or military operations, either dead or alive. That leads us to the tragic number we're all familiar with of 101. Conservative estimations today in Israeli media talk about more than 30 of them not with us anymore. And every day that passes is a danger to their lives. But what's important for me to stress regarding the hostages, Stephen, is the following. What we have experienced on October 7th is not just the most horrendous attack on Jews since the Holocaust. We as Israelis experienced something we've never experienced before. We've experienced a loss of sovereignty. Because for a few hours, the Western Negev was occupied by a foreign entity. That's what happened, and we should tell ourselves the truth and not lie to ourselves. It happened only for a few hours, but it happened. And it doesn't take a genius to look at the videos that the Nukhba and other Palestinians and Gazans took on October 7th and see the chilling sense of ownership in which they walk in the kibbutzim. They're in no rush. They conquered that territory. And it took some time for the IDF and other forces, and civilians as well, by the way, to release those places. Do you know what restores a sense of loss of sovereignty? A sense of loss of sovereignty cannot be restored with bombs and missiles only. What restores a sense of loss of sovereignty is kids running in the fields of Be'eri. Only when the kids are going to be back there, then we know we really won. And the hostages, and that leads me to your question, in this regard, are a constant reminder and evidence for this loss of sovereignty. Every second that they are there is another evidence for this loss of sovereignty. This is why what happened to them is not just a tragedy of them and their family. It's a national trauma. And as we speak, Stephen, the notion of Zionism is redefined. What we will do with the hostages will redefine Zionism as we know it for the next generation and 100 years, if you'd like, because it is based on the fundamental principle of solidarity, of Kol Israel Arevim Ze Lazeh. So this is what's happening with the hostages. It's much more than just a humane tragedy. It's a national issue that will impact the way that we Jews in and outside of Israel, and God, I hate the word diaspora.
Yes.
in and outside of Israel, view Zionism and Judaism alike.
Yeah, because when you say it's a national tragedy, national meaning the Jewish nation.
I mean you as well.
Exactly, wherever a Jew lives.
Absolutely, because on October 7th, Stephen, they have attacked you as well.
Absolutely.
Not just me. And you know, I'm one of those Israelis who believe that, look, Israel is no more mine than it's yours. Mm-hmm. The fact that I hold a blue ID card, it's not blue anymore, it's biometric now, but just for... The fact that
Listen, of course it's biometric. Yeah. It's Israel.
Exactly.
It's got to be high-tech.
And you're getting a cherry tomato when you're getting it, right? I'm joking. The fact that I hold an ID card, an Israeli ID card, and I pay taxes in Israel, and I serve proudly in our military, does not make Israel more mine than it's yours. We are part of the same Zionist project. Each and every one of us is holding the stretcher from a different angle. And the fact, Stephen, that both of us, you and I, can sit here very far from this tiny country in the Middle East, the size of New Jersey, and talk about it with such a compassion and love and care.
And passion.
Proves it the best.
And that's what's been going on here at the JNF conference.
Absolutely.
In Dallas. I mean, the energy has just been extraordinary. And I'm glad that you referenced the diaspora. I know you don't like the word diaspora because I know what you mean, because we are all one. But just for the sake of geography, we're living in the diaspora. For those Jews that are not living in Israel, and again, putting on your public diplomacy hat, what could we do? Mm-hmm. What do you recommend we do, apart from going to Israel?
Right. Remember what I said about good questions and NYU?
Yes.
That's another good question.
Thank you. I told you we try here on IsraelCast.
You should do this for a living.
I should, really. I have a whole new career ahead of me. After 8 years,
I can see the potential.
After almost 8 years of this and almost 13 years of my regular The One Way Ticket show, yes. I have a whole new career ahead of me. Thank you for that.
Like everything in the military, I would say 3 things. Mm-hmm. The first, let's talk about birds.
Birds that fly.
Yeah. You know, flocks of starlings are known for their harmony and their use of complex vocalization, which results in the fascinating images we're all familiar with. Mm-hmm. But what a lot of people don't know about them is that each bird keeps tabs with its 7 closest neighbors only and ignores everyone else. That's their secret. But it also means that no bird can see the larger, broader picture that we see, right? And my best advice for anyone who listens to us, is we need to turn ourselves from cooperative birds to informed people. Adopt a broader sense of what is going on. You always have to have context. So, for example, understanding that what's going on right now between Israel and its 7 or 8 different fronts is part of a larger, broader global war. Understanding that for many, many years, Israel has fought a proxy of a proxy. Iran is a proxy of the East. And not everyone in the East, of course, right? I'm not trying to generalize, but I'm just talking about the axes here. Iran used Hezbollah and Hamas as their proxy. But during this war, for the first time, Israel clashes with another proxy, which is equivalent to it, right? Or understanding, for example, the role that the Iranian oil plays or don't play in the world's economic. It comprises only 4% of the world's output. But why do we talk about Iranian oil so much? Right? But when you understand the economy here, so understanding the broader sense and the broader perspective on what's going on, that's the first thing I would like to say. The second thing I want to say is actually the other side of the broadening your horizons coin, which is familiarize yourselves with the nuances and the details. How many of us know who Israel's Minister of Agriculture is? Yeah. Not a lot of people, right? How can you advocate for a country without really knowing the nuances of this country, not being familiarized yourself with the nuances of the country? So knowledge, of course, is power, but it's more than that. You need to be aware of the sensitivities of the social fabric of the country, about other aspects. Because us Israelis, we don't wake up in the morning and think about Iran only. We have our own issues, the economy, our kids, our families. Familiarize yourself with the nuances of Israeli society will enable you to be a better advocate for the Israeli society. And the third thing I want to say is regards compassion. If you really, look, I always say that you'll always have the 10% who are going to be with you no matter what. And you're going to have those 10% who are going to be against you no matter what. Whereas in the middle, you're going to have those 80% who are blessed with ignorance. When you're talking to those 80%, which are not really ignorant, right? It's just a form of expression here. You should not just adopt a position of a preacher or a lecturer to those people. If you want to convince people really, don't just throw numbers at them. Express compassion and understanding, first of all, to the suffering of other people and to the places they're coming from. Find the common denominator between you and the person you're trying to convince. And once you're familiarized yourself with those nuances, and you do that through expressing a lot of compassion, that is the elusive way towards people, not just minds, but hearts. Because convincing people is not just a rational move, it's an emotional move, just like voting if you think about it.
Indeed. I'm going to build on your 10-10-80, and I'm going to invoke our mutual friend and mentor, Ido Aharoni, because he talks about 10-20-70.
If Ido says he is right and I'm wrong.
Listen, I think you both have valid points, but I think it's worth mentioning his perspective because he mentioned it. In fact, he shared it last year at the JNF conference here. It was in Denver, actually, but the JNF conference, and then also again here on the IsraelCast podcast. The 10% are those people like we saw last night outside screaming and yelling for intifada, etc. We're never going to reach them. God bless them, as my late father would say, goodbye and good luck. Okay? The 20% are people like us. The 70%, how Ido describes them actually, are those that for Israel isn't really top of mind. They might not know really a lot.
Yeah.
It's not that they don't care, but it's like an issue that we might...
They have their own lives.
They have their own lives. But if I were to ask you about the Rohingya in Myanmar, for example... Right. How do you know anything? I'm not
familiar.
Yeah, you're not
No,
familiar
you're
with it because
absolutely right.
it's just not on your radar.
Yeah,
So that 70% are those people that, again, Israel is really not on the radar. They'll check it out in the news. They'll hear something, but they don't know.
Right.
And it's so important to reach out to that 70% and to engage them, or the 80% as you call it. Whatever the percentage is, there's a vast majority of people out there. And I think one other point before we move on that is worth making, that we actually do have more allies than we think.
Yeah.
Right? And it's so important to thank them and be grateful for them and to nurture those relationships and to build further relationships as well. Well, listen, I'm super mindful of your time and the clock. And I just want to get to you for a moment because with just a couple really quick questions and then we'll wrap. So you're going back into Gaza right now. You're married.
I'm going back to reserve duty, not into Gaza.
Okay,
we're operating in a different
area.
but
you're going back. Yeah, but you're going back into reserve duty right now. Thank you for clarifying that. For you going into reservists and for your comrades going into reservists, I mean, again, it's a civilian army, right? This is not your career. You're getting your PhD, right? You're a lawyer. Yeah. I mean, it's like putting a gun in my hands and asking me to go to reservists. Of course, I'm not trained. The point being is that I'm not a full-time soldier. I'm just a civilian. So how do you mentally prepare for that? And how do your compatriots and comrades prepare to go in? I mean, what's that like the night before, say, for example?
Yeah. So first of all, my PhD it needs to be relieved. So it's currently in a coma. So I need to work on that. Look, the joke in Israel is that you are doing 3 years of mandatory military service to prepare for 30 years of reserve duty, right? Sometimes there are aspects to reserve duty that are like kind of riding a bicycle, meaning you would be amazed to know, Steven, how quickly you're becoming a soldier again. And when I'm talking about becoming a soldier, and I'm not talking about the operational aspects. Of course, when you're getting called, you have to, go to the shooting range again and take off all the dust and make sure that you are honed and you know what you're doing. You have to train. You're not just jumping into the battlefield immediately. But what I'm talking about is, again, those small moments. So, for example, the minute I'm going to wear uniforms, I'm going to be hungry again. I'm going to be tired again. I'm going to miss my wife. Because the body remembers. The body remembers. And the smells are similar. Now, this is a mental process, like what you've said. I wrote an op-ed for Yediot Achronot, which is the biggest newspaper in Israel, on October 6th, 2024, trying to explain what it means to be a reservist in the past year. And one of the things that I've wrote there is that being a reservist is also a privilege, not just because of the right to defend the Jewish people, but because it's like having a support group. Your teammates are like a support group, and this is something a lot of people don't understand. When we go back to the military, we're seeing our best friends. And while your country is going through such a trauma, seeing your best friends together can be very helpful as well. So yes, of course, it's challenging mentally to go through these phases in life. Like one day you're writing an op-ed or working on a legal project or lecturing to civilians, and on the other day you're wearing tactical uniforms preparing for a mission in Lebanon or in Gaza. But again, you have your support group. What's more challenging, and I think it's important to convey that, especially to those outside of Israel, Jews and non-Jews alike, is that many of those who bear the burden are not just us, the soldiers, but it's our families. Yeah. It's the wives, it's the husbands, it's
the kids.
It's the kids.
And the parents. And the parents, right?
And the parents, of course. And they are not the ones who are, sometimes being praised and, people clap their hands to them when they see them in the train or offer to buy them a meal when they see them in a restaurant. And they are the ones staying at home. Yeah. Need to maintain their daily routines while living with the fear. And it's important for me to convey that when we go to reserve duty, our families are on reserve duty. And that is also an explanation of how the entire country is recruited in this sense. So, of course, there's the physical aspect of reserve duty, but almost every family in Israel either has a family member who's on reserve duty or knows someone who's on reserve duty. So this is another aspect of this national task or trauma or endeavor that we're all part of these days.
And it's a unifying force, isn't it?
It is a unifying, absolutely. But again, our purpose, I can tell you from my humble and modest perspective, my purpose in life is not necessarily to be a good soldier. It's to be a good father. It's to be a good husband. We want to go back to our civilian lives and ensure that we live in a prosperous country, to ensure that when you come to our joint homeland for a visit, you're not just running away from rockets in the 7 seconds or 60 seconds that you have, depending on where you are geographically, but you're enjoying the beauty of this miracle called the State of Israel.
Indeed, and well said. So, final point, and I always like to leave on a high note. You're originally from Kiryat Gat.
Yes.
And so we discovered last night that we have a geographic connection.
Indeed.
And I want you to share that with our listeners.
Yeah, so Kiryat Gat is located in the south. For those of you who don't know, it's half an hour north to Beersheba, which is the capital of the Negev. Kiryat Gat is a twin city to Chicago.
Which is my hometown.
Exactly. And it's not because of the similarity in the skyline.
Yes.
Let me assure you that.
Can you get a good deep dish pizza, though, in Kiryat Gat?
The pizza is great. The food in Israel is wonderful
no, but,
in general.
I know the food is good,
yeah.
but I got to ask you, the deep dish pizza.
No. We have the Israeli version of pizza, not the deep dish
We're going to one-up you just on the deep dish pizza in Chicago.
All right, I'll give you that. I'll give you that.
But all the rest of the food is superior.
It's phenomenal.
Yes.
I was part of the first youth delegation from Kiryat Gat to Chicago as part of the Jewish Agency's endeavor.
To establish those sister city links.
Exactly. And I said to someone senior in the Jewish Agency a few months ago, you succeeded. Like, I'm all about Jewish peoplehood because it started there. it started there. There, I've realized, I remember going to Chicago, meeting fellow Jews, not speaking Hebrew, caring so much about Israel, understanding that they view Israel as a homeland as well. Then I've realized the true notion of Jewish peoplehood and the unique aspect of our nation as Jews in general, that we have this place that we can call home no matter what, and even more so, we have each other no matter what.
That's beautiful. And I know you also worked at Camp Ramah, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
Yeah, indeed. In Palmer, New England for 2 summers, yeah.
And you enjoyed it?
I loved it. And I have dear friends from Camp Ramah until this very day.
How great is that? Well, we look forward to welcoming you back.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. And on that note, Gadi Ezra, we're going to leave it right there. Really, thank you so much. We want to have you back. Still so much more to talk about. And we wish you much hatzlacha in your reservist duty. And we hope this war comes to a speedy end and the hostages are speedily released in good health and returned to their families. And we hope that when you come back, all of that has been achieved. So thank you so much for joining us once again.
Thank you so much.
All right, and we'll have info about Gadi on the show notes page of this episode on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And of course, we do release new episodes of the show every other Wednesday. I don't know why you'd want to miss an episode because you can always hear from people like Gadi. So you never miss an episode. Do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Simply search for IsraelCast. And of course, you can always check out the show on our website, jnf.org/IsraelCast. And as I always say, it takes a whole moshav to put IsraelCast together. For that, we thank Vivian Grossman, Stefan Oberman, J.D. Krebs, and Eli Kadrin. Our editors are Jay Rothman and James Casada from Miratone Studios in the very heart of New York City. And the music that you hear at the top until the program is titled My Eden. It's by the very talented Rafi Malkiel from his album Water on the Tzaddik label. IsraelCast is indeed powered by Jewish National Fund USA, your voice in Israel. For more info about JNF USA, do visit jnf.org. And if you'd like to write to us with story ideas or just to say howdy, I know Gadi would love to hear from you, and so would I. So do email us at IsraelCast@jnf.org. Meantime, I'm Steven Shalowitz from Dallas, Texas. Thank you for tuning in and looking forward to having you join us on future episodes of IsraelCast.